I pulled my truck into the small gravel lot of the Montana Wilderness Station, ready for my second day as a park ranger. The morning air felt crisp against my face as I stepped out, looking around at the thick forest surrounding the outpost. After yesterday's basic orientation, I was eager to get into the real work. Alvin was already waiting for me on the station's wooden porch, his weathered face serious beneath his ranger hat. He'd been friendly enough yesterday during my initial tour, but today something about his expression seemed more grave. "Morning," I called, walking toward him. He nodded once, then reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Before we start today, I need you to read this. Memorize it." I took the paper, unfolding it to find a typed list with the header "Forest Rules" at the top. There were 6 items, each one stranger than the last. 1. Never leave marked trails after sunset. 2. If you hear crying in the forest, do not investigate. 3. If you hear your name called, respond only if you can see who's calling. 4. Avoid anyone standing alone and motionless in the distance. 5. If you find yourself being watched, maintain eye contact while backing away. 6. If anything follows you, get to a well-lit area immediately. I looked up at Alvin, half smiling, waiting for him to tell me this was some kind of joke they played on new rangers. His expression hadn't changed. "This seems a bit paranoid, don't you think?" I asked, waving the paper. Alvin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Those rules aren't suggestions, Jeremy. They're essential for survival out here." I folded the paper, still not taking it seriously. Survival from what? Bears? Mountain lions? From things worse than that. Alvin's voice dropped lower. "We've lost rangers who didn't take these seriously. Good people who thought they knew better." Something in his tone made me uncomfortable. I'd expected talk about wildlife safety, weather precautions, maybe search and rescue protocols, not cryptic warnings about crying in the forest. "Like who?" I asked. "Tom Reeves, 4 years back. Heard someone calling his name while on night patrol. Went to check it out. Radio went dead 10 minutes later. Search teams found his flashlight, but never found him." Alvin looked directly into my eyes. "And he's not the only one. Keep that list with you. Follow it." I tucked the paper into my pocket, not entirely convinced but not willing to argue. "Okay. Good. Now let's get you familiar with the patrol routes." Alvin started walking toward one of the trailheads, clearly considering the matter settled. We spent the next several hours hiking along various marked paths that wound through the dense forest. Alvin pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a lightning-struck tree, a small stream crossing, and explained standard procedures for dealing with hikers, checking permits, and handling common situations. I paid attention, but part of my mind kept wandering back to that strange list. The more we walked, the more I noticed something odd. Alvin never once stepped off the marked trail, not even when it would have been easier to take a shortcut. When we came to a fallen tree blocking our path, he carefully climbed over it rather than walking a few feet into the underbrush to go around. "We always stay on the trail," he said, catching my questioning look. "Always." By late afternoon, we'd covered most of the southern patrol routes, and Alvin seemed satisfied with my grasp of the basics. He walked me back to my cabin, a small rustic structure about a quarter-mile from the main station, and reminded me to review my notes before tomorrow's shift. "And Jeremy," he added, pausing at the bottom of my porch steps, "remember those rules, especially after dark." I nodded, more to appease him than anything else, and watched him walk back toward his own cabin further up the path. Once inside, I unpacked the lunch supplies I'd brought along and made myself a simple dinner. The cabin was basic but comfortable enough: a main room with a small kitchenette, a bedroom, and a bathroom with a shower that produced lukewarm water at best. As evening settled in, I sat at the small wooden table reviewing my notes from the day. The folded rules paper sat next to my notebook, and eventually I picked it up again, rereading each item. In the growing darkness of the cabin, with the forest pressing close outside my windows, the rules seemed less ridiculous than they had in the morning light. I told myself I was just getting caught up in Alvin's intensity. The man had been out here for decades. It made sense he'd developed some superstitions. Still, there was something about the specificity of the rules that unsettled me. By 10 o'clock, fatigue from the long hike had caught up with me. I tucked the rules into my uniform pocket, turned off the lights, and went to bed, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, wind in the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I drifted off to sleep easily enough, but at what my watch later showed was 2 in the morning, I jolted awake. A sound had cut through my sleep, a woman crying. The sound came from somewhere in the forest beyond my cabin, clear and unmistakable. My first instinct was to get up and check if someone needed help. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and reached for my flashlight on the nightstand. As I stood up, the second rule from Alvin's list suddenly flashed in my mind. If you hear crying in the forest, do not investigate. I hesitated, flashlight in hand. The crying continued, sounding desperate and pained. What if someone was really hurt out there? What kind of ranger would I be if I ignored a person in distress? I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed my radio, and stepped out onto my cabin porch. The night was clear and cold, with a nearly full moon casting silver light across the clearing. The crying seemed to be coming from the tree line about 50 yards away. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet night. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The crying abruptly stopped. The sudden silence felt wrong. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just complete stillness. Then I remembered another of Alvin's rules, the one about hiding and staying quiet if anything unusual happened. A chill ran down my back that had nothing to do with the cold night air. I backed up slowly toward my door, trying not to make any sudden movements. Once inside, I locked the door, then moved quickly through the cabin, making sure all the windows were secured. I turned off every light, then sat in the darkness of my bedroom, radio clutched in my hand, listening. For several long minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard it, footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps. These were bipedal, deliberate, circling my cabin slowly. They moved from the front porch around to the side, pausing near each window as if looking in. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat perfectly still in the dark. I wanted to call Alvin on the radio, but was afraid any noise might attract attention. The footsteps continued their circuit of my cabin, sometimes speeding up, sometimes slowing down, but always maintaining that deliberate pattern. This continued for what felt like forever, but was probably about an hour according to my watch. Finally, the footsteps began to fade, moving away from the cabin and back toward the forest. Even after I could no longer hear them, I remained frozen in place, afraid that any movement might bring them back. I stayed that way until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through my window blinds. Only then did I allow myself to move, muscles stiff from sitting tensely for hours. I cautiously peeked through the blinds to see the forest looking perfectly normal in the early morning light. With the radio still gripped in my hand, I waited another half hour before finally unlocking my door and stepping outside. The morning air was cold and clear, birds were singing, and there was no sign that anything unusual had happened during the night. But as I looked down at the ground around my cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the soft earth, there were footprints circling my cabin, human-sized but somehow wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. I stood on my porch, staring at those prints and thinking about Alvin's rules. Suddenly, they didn't seem paranoid at all. I met Alvin at the station the next morning, his face showing the kind of weariness that comes from years of knowing too much. His eyes narrowed as I approached, taking in my own tired appearance. "Rough night?" he asked, leaning against the wooden railing of the station's porch. Yeah, I said, the memory of those footsteps still fresh in my mind. I heard something last night, a woman crying in the forest behind my cabin. Alvin straightened up immediately, his exhaustion giving way to sharp attention. What did you do? I almost went to check, I admitted, but I remembered the rules. I called out from my porch and the crying stopped right away. Complete silence. Then I went back inside, locked everything up, turned off all the lights. And then? Alvin's voice was tight, urgent. Footsteps, walking around my cabin for about an hour. Whatever it was stopped at each window like it was looking in. Alvin let out a long breath and nodded. You did exactly right. Exactly right. He ran a hand through his gray-streaked hair. That crying, it's a lure, Jeremy, like a fishing line cast out to see what it can catch. A lure for what? I asked. That's the question, isn't it? Alvin looked toward the tree line, his expression grim. All I know is that rangers who follow that sound don't come back. Maggie Weber was one of them 2 years ago. Experienced ranger, knew these woods better than almost anyone. She heard crying one night while closing up a remote trail station, radioed in that she was going to check it out. That was the last anyone heard from her. I thought about the footprints I'd seen that morning. Human-sized, but somehow wrong. The prints around my cabin. Best not to look too close at those, Alvin cut in. Just know you made the right choice. You're still here. The weeks that followed tested that choice again and again. The forest seemed to have noticed me, and it kept trying different ways to get my attention. During my 3rd week, I was walking the Eastern Trail, checking markers and clearing small debris. The path curved around a large boulder, and as I rounded it, I saw a man standing about 30 feet off the trail. He was completely still, facing directly toward the path. Something about his posture made my skin crawl, too rigid, too patient. Rule 4 flashed through my mind. Avoid anyone standing alone and motionless in the distance. I kept walking, maintaining my pace, not looking directly at him, but keeping him in my peripheral vision. He didn't move, didn't call out, just stood watching as I passed. I felt his gaze tracking me for the next quarter mile, boring into my back like a physical weight, though when I finally risked a glance behind me, the trail was empty. A few days later, I was checking camping permits near the lake area when I heard it. My sister's voice, clear as day, calling from somewhere deep among the trees. Jeremy? Jeremy, is that you? I froze. It sounded exactly like Sarah, the same pitch, the same slight Chicago accent she'd picked up after living there for years. Jeremy, I think I'm lost. Can you hear me? Please help. The voice grew more desperate, more frightened. My hand tightened around my radio as I remembered Rule 3. If you hear your name called, respond only if you can see who's calling. I couldn't see anyone in the dense forest where the voice came from. Just trees and shadows in the narrow trail I stood on. Jeremy, please, I'm hurt. I need help. Every instinct told me to go to her, to help my sister. But it wasn't Sarah. It couldn't be Sarah. She was in Chicago, hundreds of miles away. This was something else using her voice like a tool. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, staying firmly on the main path. The voice followed me for almost half a mile, growing increasingly frantic, then angry, before finally fading away. That night, I called Sarah on my cell phone from the safety of my cabin, just to hear her real voice. We talked about normal things, her job, our parents, a movie she'd seen. I didn't tell her about what had happened. How could I explain that something in these woods had stolen her voice to try to lure me off a trail? As the days passed, I began to understand why Alvin had been so insistent about the rules. They weren't paranoid superstitions or campfire stories meant to scare new rangers. They were survival guidelines, written in the blood and disappearances of those who came before me. Each strange encounter reinforced their importance. I saw figures watching from between trees during twilight patrols. I heard my name called in voices that sounded like friends, family, even Alvin himself when I knew he was miles away at the main station. Once, I found a trail of small personal items, a watch, a pocket knife, a hair clip, leading off the path into a particularly dense section of forest, like breadcrumbs meant to be followed. I reported everything to Alvin, who listened with grave nods but few comments beyond, "You're doing well. Keep following the rules." After a month in the forest, I no longer questioned the rules' necessity. I'd seen enough to know they were the thin line between survival and whatever fate had befallen Maggie Weber, Tom Reeves, and who knew how many others who'd been taken in by the forest deceptions. The crying woman never returned to my cabin, but sometimes on night shifts, I'd hear her distant sobs from various parts of the forest. I learned to ignore it, just as I learned to ignore the voices calling my name, the figures standing motionless among the trees, and the strange tracks that occasionally appeared on the edges of marked trails. This wasn't just wilderness, it was something else entirely, something that watched and waited and tested, and the rules were our only defense against whatever lived here long before humans came with their trails and cabins and illusion of control. I spotted it during my third week at the station. I had been hiking back from checking the eastern boundary markers, my boots crunching over the pine needles that carpeted the trail. The sun had started its slow descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. My mind was on dinner and the report I needed to file when I got back. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another tree trunk, something my tired eyes had misinterpreted in the dappled late afternoon light. But then it moved, just slightly, shifting its weight from one side to another. About 30 yards off the trail, partially hidden behind a thick pine, stood a figure watching me. It looked human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. It was too tall, at least 7 feet, with limbs that seemed too long and angular for its frame. I froze mid-step, my heart rate picking up as I stared at the thing. Rule 6 flashed through my mind. If anything follows you, get to a well-lit area immediately. But I wasn't being followed yet. I was being watched. And there was another part of Alvin's training that applied here. When I'd asked him what to do if I saw something watching me, he'd been clear: maintain eye contact while backing away. So that's what I did. I locked my eyes on what I could see of the figure and began slowly stepping backward down the trail, keeping my movement steady and deliberate. I didn't turn around, I didn't run. I just maintained that uncomfortable stare while creating distance. The figure stayed motionless for several seconds. Then it did something that made my mouth go dry. It stepped forward from behind the tree, fully revealing itself. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a frame that seemed more like a rough sketch of a human than the real thing. But it was the way it moved that disturbed me most. Its joints bent in directions they shouldn't, as if its knees and elbows could flex backward and forward with equal ease. Its head tilted at an angle that would snap a normal person's neck. I kept backing up, one careful step after another. The thing mirrored me, moving forward whenever I moved backward, maintaining the exact same distance between us. It never blinked. I couldn't even tell if it had eyelids, and its gaze never wavered from mine. This bizarre standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. My calves burned from walking backward uphill, and my eyes watered from refusing to blink, but I didn't dare look away or turn my back. The creature matched my pace precisely, never gaining ground but never giving any up either. Eventually, I felt the trail curve behind me as I reached a bend. The figure stopped at the edge of its side of the curve, its head cocking at an impossible angle, as if curious about what I would do next. Only when I was certain the bend in the trail would block its line of sight did I finally break eye contact. I turned and ran, moving as fast as I could without tripping over roots or rocks, not slowing until the ranger station came into view. I burst through the door, out of breath and sweating despite the cool afternoon. Alvin looked up from his desk, taking in my disheveled appearance with a raised eyebrow. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, setting down his pen. Between gulps of air, I told him everything: the figure, its unnatural movements, the standoff, and my retreat. Alvin listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You met one of the Watchers," he said, his voice matter of fact. "They usually test new rangers around the 3rd or 4th week. You did good, kid. Real good." "What do you mean, test?" I asked, dropping into a chair across from him. "What the hell was that thing?" Alvin sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "They watch. They wait. They see if you'll break the rules." He looked at me directly. "If you'd run right away or turned your back, it would have followed you, and trust me, you don't want that." "But what are they?" I pressed. "Are they some kind of, I don't even know what to call them, mutants? Aliens?" Alvin shook his head, a small humorless laugh escaping him. "You think I know? Nobody knows." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "All I know is they've been in these woods a hell of a lot longer than we have. The Native Americans who lived here had stories about them. The first European trappers had stories too." He paused, looking out the window at the darkening forest. "I've been here 23 years, Jeremy. 23 years of following those rules. I'm still here because I never broke them, not once." I sat there, letting his words sink in. Until that moment, part of me had still been clinging to rational explanations, rare animals, optical illusions, maybe even some elaborate hazing ritual for new rangers. But seeing that thing, with its impossible movements and dead eyes, had shattered those comfortable delusions. "So the rules," I started, "are what keep us alive," Alvin finished for me. "They're not suggestions, they're not paranoid precautions, they're survival." I nodded, understanding completely for the first time. The forest I'd been hired to protect was hiding things far stranger and more dangerous than bears or mountain lions. And Alvin, with his gruff manner and insistence on following seemingly arbitrary rules, wasn't paranoid. He was experienced. "I get it now," I said quietly. "Good," he replied, "because that Watcher, it knows your face now. It'll remember you." As darkness fell outside the station windows, I thought about the pale figure in the woods, with its unblinking stare and limbs that bent the wrong way. I thought about how it had matched my movements exactly, never gaining ground, but never giving any up either. The rules made sense now. They weren't just rules. They were a map for navigating a wilderness that contained things science couldn't explain and common sense couldn't predict. And Alvin, with his 23 years of experience, had handed me that map on my first day. I was lucky he had. I grew more comfortable with the forest's rules as autumn settled over the mountains. What had once seemed paranoid superstitions now felt like second nature, a survival instinct as basic as breathing. The golden aspens and red maples created a beautiful display that masked the dangers I knew lurked between the trees. Tourists commented on the stunning colors, unaware of what watched from those same woods after dark. By early October, I no longer hesitated when confronted with the strange occurrences that peppered my shifts. I'd memorized all 6 rules, reciting them silently each morning before leaving my cabin. The once mysterious guidelines had become my lifeline, each one written in the invisible blood of those who'd broken them. Ranger Wallace? A middle-aged man in a North Face jacket approached the station counter, his wife and 2 children standing behind him. "We heard something strange at our campsite last night. Sounded like children laughing, but it was around midnight. Our kids were asleep in the tent with us." I felt my shoulders tense. "Which campsite are you at?" "Pinewood Loop, Site 14. "You need to move. Today." I pulled out the campsite map and circled an alternative location with my pen. "Riverfront sites 23 through 28 are open. Choose any of those." The man blinked, clearly taken aback by my directness. But we've already set up everything. Is it really necessary to? Yes. I met his eyes directly. It's necessary. His wife stepped forward. Is there some kind of danger we should know about? I considered my words carefully. Alvin had taught me how to handle these situations. Be firm without causing panic. We've had reports of increased wildlife activity in that area. For your family's safety, I strongly recommend relocating. They exchanged concerned glances but nodded. As they left, I watched through the window as they loaded their children into their SUV. Another family saved without ever knowing what they'd been saved from. Later that week, a group of hikers spread a map across the information desk, pointing to a dotted line that cut across an unmarked section of the forest. The guidebook mentions this old logging trail as a shortcut to Eagle Peak, a bearded man in his 20s said. Cuts about 3 miles off the journey. Is it still passable? I shook my head immediately. That trail has been officially closed for years. It's not maintained and extremely dangerous. I traced my finger along the marked path instead. This is the only approved route to Eagle Peak, but it adds hours to the hike, his friend protested. The approved trail is the only safe option, I said, my tone leaving no room for debate. If you attempt to use unmarked paths, especially after sunset, we cannot guarantee your safety or a timely rescue if something goes wrong. The word sunset seemed to register with them. They reluctantly agreed to take the longer route, though I noticed them whispering to each other as they left. I hoped they'd heed my warning. The alternative didn't bear thinking about. As October progressed, the days grew shorter and the nights longer. The forest seemed more active after dark, as though the creatures gained strength from the lengthening shadows. I'd grown accustomed to the occasional crying in the distance, or the glimpses of tall, unnaturally thin figures standing motionless among the trees during twilight patrols. They no longer frightened me. Respect had replaced fear. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the mountains, I was closing up the station alone. Alvin had left early for a meeting with the district supervisor, and I'd volunteered to handle the final lockup. I'd just finished filing the day's incident reports and was doing a final sweep of the building when I heard it. Jeremy, help us. My father's voice, clear as day, coming from the forest edge beyond the parking lot. I froze. Key in the front door lock. It was a perfect imitation, the exact timbre and Midwestern accent I'd grown up hearing. Jeremy, please, we're lost and your mom is hurt. The voice cracked with emotion, sounding genuinely desperate. Then my mother's voice joined in, pained and frightened. Jeremy, honey, I fell. I think my leg is broken. We can't find the trail. I turned the key in the lock with deliberate calm, refusing to look toward the voices. This wasn't the first time they'd tried using family members' voices, but never more than one at a time. This was new. Jer, thank God, man. We came to surprise you but got turned around when it got dark. Xavier's voice now, with his distinctive New York inflection, and the nickname only he used. Your parents are in bad shape. We need help right now. I pulled the key from the lock and pocketed it, still not looking toward the tree line. My hands were steady as I checked that all windows were secure. The security lights kicked on automatically as darkness fell, illuminating the parking lot in harsh fluorescent light. Jeremy, please. It's Beverly. I know things ended badly between us, but I'm scared. There's something out here with us. My ex-girlfriend's voice trembled with fear, sounding exactly like her. I just wanted to talk to you, to apologize. 4 voices I knew intimately, all calling from the same section of forest. I knew without checking that my parents were safe in their suburban Chicago home. Xavier was in New York City working on his architecture firm's latest project. Beverly had moved to Seattle after our breakup. None of them were here. I walked to my truck, keys in hand, moving at a normal pace. Not rushing, not dawdling, just walking as if I heard nothing at all. Jeremy, son, please don't leave us out here. My father's voice grew frantic. Something's following us. We came all this way to see you. My mother's voice sobbed. Why are you ignoring us?" I unlocked my truck, climbed in, and started the engine without looking back. Only when I put the vehicle in reverse did I glance in my rearview mirror. They stood at the edge of the forest where the security light's reach ended, 4 figures arranged in a loose semicircle. In the dim light, they might have passed for human from a distance, but their proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending at impossible angles. They swayed slightly, like trees in a gentle breeze, though the air was still. As I backed up, they stepped forward in perfect unison, maintaining their formation. The voices continued, overlapping now in a cacophony of familiar pleas. "Jeremy, don't leave us. Son, please. Jer, what the hell, man? Jeremy, I still love you." I shifted into drive and pulled away, watching in my mirror as the figures began moving toward my truck with unnatural speed, still calling out in the voices of my loved ones. Their movements were jerky, like stop-motion animation played at the wrong speed. They reached the edge of the parking lot just as I accelerated onto the access road. The voices followed me. Somehow, despite my increasing speed, they maintained their volume as if the speakers were right outside my windows. I kept my eyes on the road, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Mile after mile, the voices continued their pleas, growing increasingly angry and threatening when I didn't respond. "You're leaving us to die," Xavier's voice snarled. "After everything we've done for you," my father's voice said, now cold and accusatory. "I thought you loved me," Beverly's voice whispered directly in my ear, though I was alone in the truck. Only when I reached the highway junction, where streetlights lined the road and other cars passed regularly, did the voices finally fade. The silence that followed felt like a physical relief, as though a weight had been lifted from my chest. I took a deep breath, my first full one since hearing my father's initial call. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. This had been different from previous encounters, more coordinated, more personal. They'd never used multiple voices simultaneously before, and never followed me so far from the forest. The creatures were adapting, learning, trying new tactics. They wanted me specifically, not just any ranger. They remembered me from previous encounters, especially that pale watcher I'd faced on the trail, and they were becoming more aggressive in their attempts to lure me into the woods after dark. I drove home to my apartment in town, checking my rearview mirror at every turn. The rules had kept me alive so far, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the entities in the forest were evolving their strategies. They were patient predators, willing to try new approaches when old ones failed, and tonight had shown me just how convincingly they could mimic those I cared about. I had evolved into a ranger as cautious and experienced as Alvin by winter. The transformation wasn't sudden but gradual, like the way frost creeps across a window pane, slowly but completely changing what was there before. What once seemed like paranoid superstition had become survival instinct, and now I found myself in Alvin's position, responsible for training new seasonal rangers and passing along the 6 critical rules that had kept me alive. Carl Carpenter stood before me in the station office, his ranger uniform still crisp and new, unlike mine which had been worn into comfortable familiarity through months of patrols. He'd arrived just yesterday from the Forest Service training program in Missoula, full of textbook knowledge but lacking the specific education this particular wilderness required. "So let me get this straight," Carl said, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at the sheet of paper I'd handed him. "I'm supposed to ignore crying in the forest? And if I hear my name, I shouldn't answer unless I can see who's calling?" His tone wasn't mocking exactly, but carried the skepticism I recognized from my own first day. "That's right," I replied, leaning back in my chair. The wood creaked beneath me, a sound that had become comforting in its familiarity. "I know how it sounds. I didn't believe it either when I started." Carl's eyes narrowed slightly. "With all due respect, these seem excessive. I mean, I understand basic safety protocols, but this reads more like..." "Like what? Folklore? Ghost stories?" I finished for him. The corner of my mouth turned up slightly, not in amusement but recognition. I'd been in his exact position months ago. Well, yeah. Carl set the paper down on the desk between us. The training manual doesn't mention anything about avoiding people standing alone in the distance. I took a deep breath, considering my approach. Alvin had been blunt with me, but that was his way. I needed to find my own method of conveying the gravity of these rules without seeming unhinged. "Let me tell you about Maggie Weber," I said, keeping my voice level. "Experienced ranger, 5 years at this station. 2 years ago, she radioed in that she was going to check out what sounded like someone crying in the eastern section. That was her last communication. Search teams found her radio and flashlight, never found Maggie." Carl's expression shifted slightly. "That could have been a wildlife attack or—" "Tom Reeves," I continued. "Went to investigate his name being called during night patrol 4 years back. Same result. And before you suggest it was a bear or mountain lion, explain to me why we found his flashlight with the batteries arranged in a perfect circle next to it." The office fell quiet. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, adding to the thick blanket that already covered the ground. "These rules," I tapped the paper with my index finger, "aren't suggestions or paranoid guidelines. They're survival instructions written in the blood of rangers who ignored them." Carl picked up the paper again, reading through the 6 rules more carefully this time. "You really believe all this?" "It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is that I'm still here." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the white landscape. 3 months ago, I was just like you. Thought Alvin was being dramatic or trying to haze the new guy. Now I understand why he was so insistent. I turned back to face Carl. "You don't have to believe me, but you do have to follow these rules if you want to make it through the season." The next few weeks were a test, not just for Carl, but for me as well. Teaching someone else meant reinforcing my own vigilance. I took Carl on the same orientation hikes Alvin had taken me on, pointing out landmarks and explaining procedures. I showed him the proper way to stay on marked trails, even when it meant climbing over obstacles rather than going around them. What struck me most was how my own relationship with the forest had changed. I no longer felt fear when hearing crying at night or seeing shadowy figures watching from between trees. The rules had become automatic responses requiring no conscious thought, like a driver hitting the brakes at a red light. One evening in late January, Carl and I were returning from checking the western boundary markers. The sun was setting earlier these days, casting long shadows across the snow-covered trail. "You ever actually seen anything out here?" Carl asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "Besides normal wildlife, I mean." I considered the question carefully. "Yes." "What was it?" "I don't know exactly," I admitted. "Something tall with limbs that bent wrong, pale skin stretched too tight." I glanced at him. It watched me for 10 minutes while I backed up the trail, never blinked once. Carl was quiet for a moment. "And you're sure it wasn't just—" "I'm sure." I cut him off gently but firmly. "Look, I get it. I tried to rationalize everything too. Thought it was all rare animals, tricks of light, maybe even some kind of hazing ritual. But at some point the explanations get more far-fetched than just accepting what's in front of you." We walked in silence for a while, our boots crunching through the snow. The trees around us grew darker as twilight deepened. 3 o'clock, I said quietly, not turning my head. "About 40 yards in. Don't stare directly at it." To his credit, Carl didn't freeze or make any sudden movements. He continued walking at the same pace, only his eyes shifting slightly to the right. "I see it," he whispered. "What? What is that?" A figure stood motionless among the trees, partially hidden behind a thick trunk. Even from this distance, I could tell its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Rule 5, I said calmly. "If you find yourself being watched, maintain eye contact while backing away. But since we're on the trail and it's not directly approaching, We keep moving at normal pace without engaging. Carl's breathing had quickened, but he kept walking steadily beside me. It's following our movement. I know, they do that. Don't look directly at it unless it comes closer. We continued down the path, and eventually the figure remained behind as we rounded a bend in the trail. Carl let out a long, shaky breath. Jesus Christ, he muttered. That was real. That was actually real. I nodded. That's why we have the rules. Back at the station, Carl sat at the table with a mug of coffee clutched between his hands. The skepticism that had marked his expression for weeks was gone, replaced by something closer to Alvin's perpetual alertness. You know what's weird? He said finally. I'm not as scared as I thought I'd be. Seeing that thing, I mean. I understood exactly what he meant. Fear isn't helpful out here. Respect is. Respect for the rules, respect for the boundaries. The forest's dangers continued testing me, but in different ways than before. I noticed the creatures seemed to adapt their tactics, trying new methods to lure me off paths or into the deep woods after dark. One night, instead of crying or calling my name, I heard what sounded like a car accident, screeching tires, shattering glass, people screaming for help, all coming from a section of forest where no road existed for miles. Another time, while checking campsites during an early morning patrol, I found what appeared to be a child's stuffed bear placed deliberately in the center of an unmarked game trail. Next to it lay what looked like small footprints leading deeper into the woods. I reported both incidents to Alvin, who nodded grimly and added them to his own records. I began documenting these patterns meticulously in a journal, adding to my understanding of the rules' importance and the specific threats each one addressed. The journal became a field guide of sorts, not to the normal wildlife of the park, but to its other inhabitants. January 15th. Voices mimicking park visitors asking for directions after station closing hours came from East Tree Line. Did not investigate. January 23rd. Found perfect circle of pine cones outside cabin window this morning. Each cone positioned exactly the same distance apart. No human or animal tracks in snow around them. February the 2nd. Patrol vehicle's radio picked up woman's voice, counting backwards from 100 despite being turned off. Voice stopped at 57 when I reached main road. Through this process, I gained a deeper appreciation for the wisdom embedded in those guidelines that once seemed excessive, but now formed the foundation of my survival strategy. Each rule addressed a specific tactic used by whatever lived in these woods. Rule 1 prevented you from being isolated in darkness. Rule 2 stopped you from following lures. Rules 3 and 4 helped you avoid mimics. Rules 5 and 6 gave you protocols for when you were already being hunted. One afternoon in mid-February, Carl and I were in the station organizing supply inventories when he asked a question that had clearly been on his mind for some time. "What do you think they want?" he asked, looking up from his clipboard. "These things in the forest. Why do they try to lure rangers away?" I closed the cabinet I'd been checking and turned to face him. "Honestly, I don't know. Alvin's been here 23 years, and he doesn't know either. The local tribes had stories about them long before European settlers arrived. Some old trappers' journals mention them too. But they're clearly intelligent," Carl pressed. "They use strategy, they learn and adapt." "Yes," I agreed. "That's what makes the rules so important. They're not just random superstitions, they're counters to specific tactics we've observed." Carl nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about Rule 3 a lot. The one about not responding to your name unless you can see who's calling." "What about it?" "It implies these things know our names somehow. That they're listening to us, learning about us." I hadn't considered that specific angle before, but Carl was right. Could be. Or maybe they just pick up whatever they hear and repeat it. Either way, the rule works," Carl finished. "Exactly. Later that night in my cabin, I sat at my small desk reviewing my journal entries from the past month. The patterns were becoming clearer. The entities were most active during new moons and after heavy snowfall. They seemed to prefer targeting individuals who had recently arrived at the park. And most importantly, they appeared to remember those who had successfully evaded them, becoming more persistent and creative in their approaches over time. I added these observations to my notes, thinking about how I'd evolved since my first week here. The rules that once seemed like paranoid restrictions had become second nature, as natural as checking the weather before a hike or carrying bear spray. I finally understood why Alvin had been so insistent during my first day. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to keep me alive long enough to understand. As I closed my journal and prepared for bed, I realized something that brought an unexpected sense of calm. I was no longer afraid of the forest. I respected its dangers and maintained constant vigilance, but the paralyzing fear I'd felt during those first encounters was gone. I had become like Alvin, watchful, cautious, and above all, prepared. The rules had kept me alive this long. They would continue to do so as long as I respected them and passed that respect on to others who would walk these trails. That was my responsibility now, to ensure Carl and any future rangers understood not just what the rules were, but why they existed. Because out here in this particular wilderness, following the rules wasn't just about park policy or good practice. It was about survival. I patrolled a remote section of the park following the heavy snowfall from last night, my boots crunching through 8 inches of fresh powder. The snow had transformed the familiar landscape into something new. Pine branches sagged under white weight, rock formations wore thick caps, and the silence felt deeper than usual. Even the normal forest sounds were muffled under the blanket of white. I paused at a bend in the trail, taking a moment to catch my breath. That's when I spotted them, footprints leading off the marked path and into the dense trees. Human-sized, but something about them seemed wrong. The spacing between steps was irregular, sometimes too close together, then suddenly stretching to impossible distances. Each impression sank unusually deep into the snow, as if whoever made them carried tremendous weight despite the human-sized shoe pattern. I knelt down to examine one of the prints more closely. The outline resembled a hiking boot, but the impression was at least twice as deep as my own footprints in the same snow. I pulled out my radio, following the protocol Alvin had drilled into me during training. "Station, this is Jeremy. I found some unusual tracks about 4 miles up the North Ridge Trail. Going to investigate, but will maintain regular contact." The radio crackled with Carl's response. "Copy that, Jeremy. 15-minute check-ins. Don't go beyond radio range." Understood. First check-in at 1300 hours. I clipped the radio back to my belt and looked at my watch. 12:45. I had plenty of daylight left, but I'd need to be efficient. I took a photo of the tracks with my department-issued camera before starting to follow them, careful to walk beside the prints rather than disturb them. The tracks led deeper into the forest, weaving between trees in a pattern that made little sense for normal human movement. Sometimes they'd circle a particular tree before continuing. Other times they'd zigzag sharply for no apparent reason. After about 10 minutes of following, I stopped to make my first check-in. "Station, Jeremy here. Still following the tracks. They lead about half a mile east of the North Ridge Trail. No sign of hikers yet." "Copy that," Carl responded. "Keep us posted." I continued following the strange footprints, which now seemed to gain purpose, heading more directly through the trees. The forest grew denser here, the snow-laden branches creating a canopy that dimmed the daylight. After another 15 minutes and another check-in, the tracks led me into a small clearing. What I found was clearly an abandoned campsite. A blue 2-person tent was partially collapsed, one side caved in as if something had pressed against it. Camping equipment lay scattered across the snow, a propane stove tipped on its side, sleeping bags half pulled from the tent, food supplies spilled from an overturned cooler. Everything about the scene suggested the occupants had left in a hurry. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any movement or signs of danger. "Hello? Forest Service. Anyone here?" My voice sounded flat in the snow-muffled air. No response. After confirming I was alone, I began to document the scene, taking photos of the campsite from multiple angles. The tent had no visible tears or damage beyond its collapsed state. No blood or signs of animal attack, just the chaotic disarray of a hasty departure. Near what must have been their fire pit, now covered in snow, I found a small notebook with a leather cover. I picked it up, brushing away the snow, and opened to the first page. The inside cover had a name written in blue ink, "Property of Tyler Brooks." I made my next radio check-in. "Station, I've found an abandoned campsite. Shows signs of being left in a hurry. Located approximately 1 mile east of the North Ridge Trail. I've found identification for someone named Tyler Brooks. Any reports of missing hikers?" Carl's voice came back after a moment. "Negative on missing persons reports in the last 24 hours. Continue investigation, but start heading back within the hour. Snow's picking up again according to the Weather Service." I acknowledged and turned my attention back to the journal. Flipping through the pages, I found daily entries dating back about a week. The first few were typical hiking observations, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, weather notes, but the entries from the last 3 days grew increasingly disturbed. Day 5. Mark says I'm imagining things, but I know what I saw. There were people watching us from the trees today. When I pointed them out, they were gone. Too tall to be normal hikers. Something about them seemed wrong. The next entry was shorter. Day 6. Heard voices calling at night. Mark didn't hear anything. Said it was just the wind. It wasn't the wind. Someone was calling my name. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The final entry was dated yesterday. Day 7. Woke up to crying last night. A woman. Mark says we should pack up and leave, but I need to know who's out there. The crying sounds so sad, so lost. I'm going to find her while Mark breaks camp. I know the rules say stick together, but she sounds like she really needs help. The entry ended there. I closed the journal, my hands slightly unsteady. Tyler had broken the cardinal rule of wilderness safety: never separate from your group. And he'd gone looking for the crying woman, just like Maggie Weber had done before she disappeared. I secured the journal in my pack and finished documenting the site. There were 2 sets of footprints leading away from the camp, one heading back toward the main trail, likely Mark's, and another set following the strange tracks I'd been pursuing. Tyler had followed whatever had been luring him. After marking the coordinates of the campsite on my GPS, I made another radio check-in, updating Carl on what I'd found. The daylight was already starting to fade. Winter days were short, and the heavy cloud cover made them shorter. I needed to head back. "I'm securing the site and returning to the station," I told Carl. "We'll follow the regular trail back." "Copy that. Weather's deteriorating. Get back before dark." I took one last look around the campsite, then started back toward the marked trail, choosing not to follow either set of departing footprints. The strange tracks that had led me here were disturbing enough, and I had no intention of meeting whatever had made them. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I heard it, a voice calling from somewhere in the trees to my right. "Help! Please, somebody help me!" The voice sounded young, male, and in distress. It could have been Tyler Brooks, based on the journal I'd found, but I remembered rule number 3. Never respond to your name being called unless you can see who's calling. This wasn't my name, but the principle was the same. I kept walking, focusing on the path ahead. "I can see you. Please, I'm hurt," the voice called again, more desperate now. "My name is Tyler. I fell and I can't move." I faltered for just a moment. The mention of the name matched the journal in my backpack. But I'd been trained for this. I'd experienced similar lures before. I kept walking, picking up my pace slightly. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards off the trail, a human figure lying in the snow. From my angle, it looked like a young man in a red jacket, one leg bent at an awkward angle. He raised a hand weakly as if waving for attention. "Please," the voice called again, seeming to come from the figure. "I've been out here all night." Every instinct wanted me to help, to run over and offer aid to someone clearly injured. But Alvin's warnings echoed in my head. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd described, the entities using our human instinct to help against us. I remembered Maggie Weber and how she'd disappeared investigating crying sounds. I thought of Tom Reeves, gone after hearing his name called. Instead of approaching, I turned and took the longer route around, a side trail that looped back to the main path. It would add 20 minutes to my journey, but it would keep me on marked trails and away from whatever was lying in the snow. "I see you ignoring me," the voice called, suddenly angry. "Why won't you help me? I'm dying out here." I didn't look back. I kept walking, maintaining my pace, focusing on the trail markers. The voice continued calling, alternating between pleading and threatening, until I rounded a bend in the trail and could no longer hear it. The rest of my hike back to the station was tense but uneventful. I made my regular radio check-ins, and with each step closer to the station, my breathing became a little easier. By the time the station came into view, the sky had darkened considerably, and fresh snow was beginning to fall. I pushed through the door, stamping snow from my boots. Carl looked up from the desk, his expression shifting to concern when he saw my face. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I placed Tyler's journal on the desk and sank into a chair. My hands were trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Physically, I was unharmed, but the image of that figure in the snow and the knowledge of what had likely happened to Tyler Brooks left me visibly shaken. "We need to file a missing persons report," I said finally, "and we need to warn hikers to stay out of the north section until further notice." I readied myself for the joint search operation with the local police, checking my gear one final time before we headed out. 3 hikers had gone missing in the forest 2 days ago, and time was running short for finding them alive. What made my stomach twist was knowing exactly which areas the search zone included, sections of the forest where I'd personally encountered some of the most active, strange entities. "Everyone gather around," I called to the assembled group of rangers and police officers in the station's main room. About 20 people crowded in, some sitting on folding chairs, others standing against the walls. Maps of the search area were spread across the large table in the center. Sheriff Donovan, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and 20 years of local experience, nodded to me. "Ranger Wallace has something important to share before we head out." I cleared my throat, looking at the faces of people who had no idea what they might encounter out there. "Before we deploy, I need to establish some non-negotiable protocols for this operation." A few officers exchanged glances, probably wondering why a ranger was setting terms for a police-led search. "First, no one goes anywhere alone. Groups must stay together with a minimum of 3 people at all times." I let that sink in before continuing. "Second, no one separates from their group, even briefly, not to check something out, not to take a bathroom break, not for any reason." "That seems excessive," one of the younger officers said. "It's not." I kept my voice firm. "And third, everyone, and I mean everyone, needs to return to base before sunset, regardless of what progress you've made or what you think you've found." Sheriff Donovan stepped forward. "I've worked with Ranger Wallace before. His protocols have kept people safe in these woods. We follow them without exception." I appreciated his backup, though I knew he didn't fully understand why these rules mattered. He just knew I'd helped recover lost hikers before without losing any search team members. "One last thing," I added. "If you hear someone calling for help but can't see them, report it by radio, but do not investigate without the entire group and approval from base." The teams were divided, radios checked, and search patterns assigned. I made sure to join the team heading to the northeastern quadrant, the area closest to where I'd encountered the Watcher months ago. If anything unusual happened, I wanted to be there to handle it. Our team consisted of myself, Officer Martinez, Officer Keegan, and Deputy Flores. We drove to our starting point and began our sweep through dense pine forest, calling the missing hikers' names and scanning the underbrush for any signs of human passage. The morning passed without incident. We found a few footprints that might have belonged to the hikers, but the trail disappeared at a rocky outcropping. By early afternoon, the radio chatter had grown less frequent as other teams reported similar dead ends. "Over here," Martinez called suddenly, pointing to something bright blue against the brown forest floor. We approached carefully. A backpack lay partially hidden under fallen leaves, its blue nylon material torn along one side. "That matches the description of what one of the missing hikers was carrying," Flores said, checking her notes. I pulled on gloves before picking it up. "Let's see if there's any ID inside." The backpack contained typical hiking supplies: a water bottle, trail mix, a first aid kit, and a small digital camera. We found a wallet with an ID confirming it belonged to Eric Sampson, one of our missing hikers. "We should check the camera," Keegan suggested. "Might show where they were headed." I turned on the camera and navigated to the photo gallery. The most recent images showed typical hiking shots: selfies of 3 smiling people on trails, panoramic views from lookout points, close-ups of interesting plants. Then I reached the final set of photos, taken yesterday according to the timestamp. "What the hell is that?" Martinez leaned over my shoulder as I stared at a blurry image. The photo showed the forest at dusk. Between 2 trees in the background, partially hidden but unmistakable to me, was an elongated figure with impossibly thin limbs. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. I clicked to the next photo. Another similar shot, but this time with 2 figures watching from different positions. The third photo was extremely blurry, as if taken while running, but showed the same type of entities, closer now. "Those look like people," Flores said, but her voice held uncertainty. "Not people," I said quietly, "and this explains a lot about what happened to our hikers." I showed them the final photo. The camera apparently dropped on the ground, capturing a tilted image of trees and, at the edge of the frame, a pale, stretched hand reaching toward the lens. "Jesus," Keegan whispered. I carefully packed the camera into an evidence bag. "We need to report this and continue our sweep." As I radioed our findings to base, I noticed the sun had begun its westward descent. We had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. We continued our search with renewed urgency, but also heightened caution. The mood had shifted. Even the skeptics in our group now moved with tense alertness. Around 4 o'clock, with shadows lengthening between the trees, the radio crackled to life. "Base to all teams, we're getting strange reports. Team Charlie reports hearing Jason Miller's voice calling from the ravine area. Simultaneously, Team Echo reports hearing the same voice calling from the ridge 2 miles west. Please confirm any voice contact immediately." I felt a chill run down my back. This was exactly what I'd feared. Within minutes, 3 other teams reported hearing the missing hikers' voices, calling from different directions simultaneously, an impossibility that confirmed my worst suspicions. I grabbed my radio. "This is Ranger Wallace. All teams need to return to base immediately. I repeat, all teams return to base now." "This is Team Delta," came a reply. "We're hearing Eric Sampson calling for help just beyond the tree line. He sounds injured. We're going to investigate." "Negative, Team Delta," I responded sharply. "Those are not the hikers. Return to base immediately." Our team was already heading back, moving at a brisk pace. Martinez looked at me questioningly. "The forest is playing tricks," I said simply. "Those voices aren't human." The radio erupted with chatter as several officers protested the order to return. They were hearing desperate pleas for help, claims of broken legs and injuries. voices that sounded exactly like the missing hikers. Sheriff Donovan's voice cut through the chaos. "All teams, this is Sheriff Donovan. Follow Ranger Wallace's order. Return to base now." As we hurried back along the trail, the forest grew darker around us. I heard a faint voice calling my name from somewhere to our left, a perfect imitation of Alvin's voice. I ignored it and kept our group moving. We reached the command post just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Most teams had returned, but Team Delta was still out there despite repeated radio calls. "They went to investigate the voice," Sheriff Donovan told me, worry etched on his face. "Lieutenant Parker said they could see someone waving from a clearing." I shook my head. "Keep trying to reach them, but do not send anyone else out there, not until morning." As full darkness fell, Team Delta finally responded. Their voices were shaky, frightened. They reported being surrounded by something in the trees and were running back toward base along the main trail. I ordered all floodlights turned on around the perimeter of our command post, a cluster of 3 buildings including the ranger station and 2 temporary structures. Every light inside the buildings was also switched on. "No one leaves the buildings tonight," I announced to the assembled search teams. "No matter what you hear, no matter who you think is out there calling for help, no one steps outside until daylight." Team Delta made it back 20 minutes later, bursting through the door with wild eyes and ragged breathing. Lieutenant Parker described seeing figures moving between trees, tall, thin figures that matched exactly what I'd seen in the camera photos. As the night deepened, I heard it, something massive moving through the forest surrounding our command post. Not just in one spot, but all around us, circling. Occasionally branches would crack or leaves would rustle, but mostly it was the feeling of being watched by multiple sets of eyes from the darkness beyond our lights. Some of the officers wanted to investigate the sounds. I firmly refused. "The lights stay on," I repeated whenever anyone suggested otherwise, "and no one leaves the buildings." It was the longest night of my career. The sounds continued intermittently, sometimes voices calling names of people in our search teams, sometimes crying, sometimes just movement. I didn't sleep, instead patrolling between the 3 buildings to ensure everyone followed the rules. When the first gray light of dawn appeared, the forest fell completely silent. I waited until full daylight before allowing anyone outside. Sheriff Donovan and I were the first to step out, walking carefully around the perimeter of the command post. That's when we found them. Strange footprints encircling the entire perimeter of the base. They looked human-sized, but with wrong proportions. Toes too long, arch too high. And each track stopped exactly where the floodlight's reach ended, as if whatever made them couldn't or wouldn't step into the light. "What made these?" Sheriff Donovan asked, crouching to examine one print. I just shook my head. "Something that's been in these woods a lot longer than we have." We found Team Delta's tracks returning to base, pursued by something with a different gait, something that sometimes walked on 2 legs and sometimes on 4, with prints that showed impossible spacing between steps. The footprints told the story of last night clearly. Our command post had been surrounded, watched, tested, and only the light had kept whatever was out there from coming closer. I stood in the station on a crisp December morning, waiting for Alice Shaw's arrival. My fingers ran over the edges of the paper in my hand, my own handwritten copy of the 6 rules with notes I'd added during my time here. The ink had faded slightly where I'd folded and unfolded it countless times, studying the words that had kept me alive. The station felt different in winter, quieter. The forest seemed to pull back, but that was an illusion. If anything, the entities became more active when the snow fell, their strange footprints more visible against the white backdrop. I'd learned that the hard way. I thought about the rangers who hadn't made it. Tom Reeves, whose flashlight we found with the batteries arranged in a perfect circle. Maggie Weber, whose radio still sat in Alvin's desk drawer as a reminder. Both had broken the rules. Both had vanished. And then there was Tyler Brooks, whose journal entries chronicled his final days before he went looking for that crying woman in the woods. My own survival had seemed unlikely when I first arrived. If I hadn't trusted Alvin's warnings that sounded like paranoid superstition at first, I'd be gone too. That first night when I heard the crying woman behind my cabin, I'd almost gone to investigate. Almost. The clock on the wall ticked past 9. Alice would be here any minute. She came highly recommended from the Montana Division, with solid outdoor experience, but experience in normal forests wouldn't help her here. Nothing prepared you for this place except the rules. Through the window, I spotted a dark blue pickup turning into the gravel lot. It pulled to a stop next to my truck, and a woman stepped out, adjusting her ranger hat. Alice Shaw had arrived. I tucked the rules into my shirt pocket and headed for the door. The wooden floorboards creaked under my boots as I crossed the main room. Outside, the cold air bit at my face. My breath formed clouds that hung in the still air. "Alice Shaw?" I called out, walking toward her truck. She turned and smiled, extending her hand. "That's me. You must be Ranger Wallace." "Jeremy," I said, shaking her hand. "Welcome to the most challenging station in the Forest Service." Alice looked around at the surrounding trees, their branches heavy with snow. "It's beautiful here." "It is," I agreed, though the word beautiful wasn't how I thought of these woods anymore. "Let's get you inside. There are some things we need to go over before your first patrol." As we walked toward the station, I felt the weight of responsibility. I was about to give her the same serious talk Alvin had given me months ago, the talk I'd almost laughed at until I learned better. Would she take it seriously? Or would she think I was crazy, like I'd thought Alvin was? The orientation packet mentioned standard procedures, but said you'd brief me on local protocols, Alice said as we climbed the porch steps. "That's right." I held the door open for her. "There are specific rules for this forest that aren't in any official manual." Inside, I gestured for her to take a seat at the main desk while I poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot I'd made earlier. The station was warm, the heater humming steadily against the winter chill. "Before we start," I said, setting the mugs down and taking the seat across from her, "I need to know you'll take what I'm about to tell you seriously. Your life depends on it." Alice's smile faded, replaced by a look of careful attention. "Okay, you have my full attention." I reached for my pocket, ready to pull out the list of rules, when the radio on the desk crackled to life. "Base, this is Carpenter. Do you copy?" "Over." Carl's voice came through with an urgency that made me reach for the receiver immediately. "This is Wallace. Go ahead, Carl." "Jeremy, we've got a situation. Alvin went to check those reports of unusual noises near the eastern boundary 3 hours ago. He was supposed to radio in every 30 minutes, but we haven't heard from him since his first check-in. His truck is still at the eastern trailhead." My stomach dropped. Alvin was the most careful, most experienced ranger here. He wrote the rules. He never broke them. "Did he say anything specific in his last transmission?" I asked, aware of Alice watching me with growing concern. "Just that he was heading up to Marker 14 to investigate. Said he heard something unusual but didn't specify what." I checked my watch. It was 9:23 in the morning. If Alvin had been out of contact for hours and his truck was still there. "I'm heading out to look for him," I said. "Send the coordinates to my GPS." "Copy that. Be careful out there." I set the receiver down and looked at Alice, whose expression had shifted from confusion to alarm. "I'm sorry, but orientation will have to wait. One of our senior rangers is missing." "I can help with the search," Alice offered immediately, standing up. I shook my head. "No, not until you know the rules. It's too dangerous." "What rules? What's going on?" I pulled the paper from my pocket and placed it on the desk. "Read these, memorize them. They're not suggestions, they're survival requirements. I have to go find Alvin, but when I get back, we'll go through them in detail." Alice picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the 6 rules with obvious confusion. "Never investigate crying in the forest. Don't respond to your name unless you can see who's calling. This sounds like..." Like superstition? Like ghost stories? That's what I thought too at first. I moved to the equipment locker and began gathering what I'd need. Flashlight, extra batteries, radio, first aid kit, water, protein bars, map. Every ranger who's disappeared from this station broke one of those rules. I checked my watch again. Hours until sunset, but winter days were short. The thought of being in those woods after dark made my pulse quicken. I had never, not once, broken Rule 1. Never leave marked trails after sunset. But if Alvin was out there... Stay here at the station, I told Alice. Carl should be back from his patrol in an hour. Tell him I've gone to look for Alvin and that I'll maintain radio contact. Jeremy, Alice said, still holding the rules. What exactly is out there? I paused, zipping up my jacket. How to explain what I'd seen? The watchers with their impossible joints. The voices that knew your name and mimicked people you loved. The footprints that were almost human, but wrong. Something that's been here longer than us, I finally said. Something that watches and waits and learns. Something that wants us to break the rules. I shouldered my pack and checked my radio. I'm going to find Alvin and bring him back. But if I'm not back by sunset, lock all the doors, turn on all the lights, and don't let anyone or anything in until morning, no matter what you hear or see. Alice's face had gone pale, but she nodded. Be careful. As I headed for my truck, I ran through all 6 rules in my mind, adding my own mental notes from months of encounters. 1. Never leave marked trails after sunset. The entities are more active, more aggressive at night. 2. If you hear crying in the forest, do not investigate. It's always a lure, never a real person in need. 3. If you hear your name called, respond only if you can see who's calling. They can mimic voices perfectly, but can't fully replicate appearances. 4. Avoid anyone standing alone and motionless in the distance. The watchers test your curiosity, waiting for you to approach. 5. If you find yourself being watched, maintain eye contact while backing away. Breaking eye contact triggers pursuit. 6. If anything follows you, get to a well-lit area immediately. Light is the only consistent deterrent. I started my truck and headed toward the eastern trailhead, trying not to think about what it meant that Alvin, who had survived 23 years in these woods by never breaking the rules, was missing. The drive took 20 minutes along snow-covered service roads. Alvin's truck sat alone in the small clearing that served as a trailhead parking area. I pulled up beside it, noting there were no other vehicles. No sign of disturbance around his truck either. I grabbed my gear and radio. Base, this is Wallace. I'm at the eastern trailhead. Alvin's truck is here. No signs of struggle. I'm heading up the trail to marker 14. We'll report every 15 minutes. Copy that, Wallace. Alice's voice came back, professional despite her earlier shock. Be safe out there. The trail ahead disappeared into dense pines, their branches heavy with snow. Somewhere beyond those trees, Alvin might be hurt, lost, or... I pushed the thought away. Alvin knew these woods better than anyone. If anyone could survive out here, it was him. But as I checked my watch and calculated the hours until sunset, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to break the most important rule of all: never enter the forest after dark. If I didn't find Alvin soon, I'd have to make an impossible choice: leave him out there overnight or risk becoming another missing ranger myself. I took a deep breath of cold air, adjusted my pack, and stepped onto the trail, knowing that my survival depended on applying everything Alvin had taught me about the dangers lurking in these woods, and hoping it would be enough to find him before darkness fell. I moved through the forest at night, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness ahead of me. Every step I took broke another promise I'd made, to Alice, to Carl, to myself. Most importantly, I was breaking the very first rule I'd sworn to uphold: never leave marked trails after sunset. "Alvin!" I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense pines surrounding me. The snow crunched under my boots as I followed the trail markers, desperately scanning for any sign of my missing mentor. I checked my watch. Just past 8 in the evening. I'd been searching for almost 10 hours now, with only brief radio check-ins with Alice back at the station to break the monotony of fear. She'd told me Carl had returned and wanted me back immediately, but I couldn't leave Alvin out here alone. "You have to come back," Alice had said during our last check-in. "Carl says it's too dangerous." "I can't," I'd replied. "Not until I find him." Now, as full darkness wrapped around the forest, I knew I was testing the limits of everything Alvin had taught me. The irony wasn't lost on me, breaking his rules to try to save him. I kept my flashlight beam steady, focusing on the trail markers. At least I could follow protocol as best I could, staying on marked paths, keeping my radio close, and maintaining constant vigilance. The forest felt different at night, alive in ways I couldn't explain. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision, but I refused to look directly at them. A twig snapped somewhere to my left. I didn't turn to look. Jeremy. My name floated through the trees, carried on a breeze that didn't exist. I ignored it, just as Alvin had taught me. Rule 3. If you hear your name called, respond only if you can see who's calling. I couldn't see anyone. "Jeremy, help me." The voice sounded like Alvin, but came from somewhere off the trail. I kept walking, focusing on the path ahead. These things weren't Alvin. They were never who they pretended to be. I reached marker 14, where Alvin had last reported in. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of struggle, no equipment, nothing to indicate what might have happened to him. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, searching the ground for tracks, broken branches, anything. The beam caught something reflective about 20 yards ahead. I moved forward cautiously, staying on the trail, until I could make out what it was. A radio. Alvin's radio, lying abandoned on the ground, near what looked like the entrance to a cave. I frowned. There were no caves marked on any park maps in this area. I approached slowly, keeping my light trained on the radio. Next to it lay Alvin's flashlight, its beam still weakly illuminating the snow. I picked up both items, checking the radio. Dead. The flashlight batteries were nearly spent too. Looking up at the cave entrance, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Strange symbols carved into the rock around the opening. They weren't anything I recognized. Not Native American, not English, not anything human as far as I could tell. They looked ancient, worn by time, but still visible, curving and twisting in patterns that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. "Jeremy." This time the voice came from inside the cave. It sounded exactly like Alvin, his gruff tone, the slight Montana drawl. "Jeremy, I'm hurt. I need help." I stood frozen at the cave entrance, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the darkness inside. Every instinct told me to run, to get back to the station, to follow the rules. But this was Alvin. If there was even a chance he was alive in there. "Alvin?" I called, not stepping inside yet. "Is that you?" "Jeremy, thank God," the voice replied. "I fell. I think my leg's broken. I can't move." I hesitated. This could be a trap. It probably was a trap. But what if it wasn't? What if Alvin really was injured in there, and I left him to die? I pulled out my backup flashlight from my pack. If I was going to do this, I needed to be prepared. "I'm coming in," I said, more to myself than to the voice. I stepped into the cave, breaking yet another unwritten rule. The air inside was cold and still, with a musty smell that reminded me of old basements and forgotten places. My flashlight beam swept across the cave walls, revealing more of those strange symbols carved everywhere. "Alvin?" I called again. "Back here," the voice replied, sounding weaker now. "Hurry." I moved deeper into the cave, my boots echoing on the stone floor. The passage narrowed, then widened into a larger chamber. What I saw there made me stop in my tracks. The walls of the chamber were lined with shelves, natural ledges in the rock, but arranged too perfectly to be accidental. On these shelves were hundreds, maybe thousands of personal items: watches, wallets, keys, hiking boots, backpacks, ranger badges, cameras, phones, all neatly arranged like exhibits in a museum. I picked up one of the wallets with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside was a driver's license for a Thomas Jenkins dated 1987. I grabbed another, Sarah Miller, 1993, another, David Chen, 2005. These belonged to missing persons, people who had disappeared in these woods over decades. My flashlight beam caught something familiar, a Forest Service badge. I moved closer and saw the name, Thomas Reeves. Next to it was a small tape recorder labeled M. Weber in neat handwriting, Maggie's recorder. This was a collection, a trophy room. "Jeremy, please." The voice came from deeper in the cave, where a narrow passage led to another chamber. I saw something green hanging on the wall of that passage, Alvin's jacket. I took a step toward it, then froze as a sound came from behind me. A scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Then another sound, a wet, clicking noise that no human throat could make. Trap. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal something moving at the cave entrance. Something tall and thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. It was blocking the way out. I'd walked right into it, just like all the others, but I had one advantage they might not have had. I knew these things. I'd been studying them for months now. I knew their behaviors, their patterns. Rule 5. If you find yourself being watched, maintain eye contact while backing away. I locked eyes with the creature, if you could call those dark hollows eyes, and began backing up slowly, not toward the passage with Alvin's jacket, but toward a narrow crevice I'd noticed in the wall to my right. It looked just big enough for a person to squeeze through. The creature moved forward, matching my pace, its head tilted at an impossible angle, neck bent almost backward. It made that wet clicking sound again. "Jeremy, what are you doing?" The voice from the back passage now sounded angry. "I need help." I kept my eyes on the creature blocking the entrance, still backing toward the crevice. "You're not Alvin," I said. A second clicking sound came from the back passage, then a third from somewhere above me. There were more of them. I reached the crevice and began squeezing through sideways, still facing the creature. It lunged forward suddenly, moving with that jerky, stop-motion speed I'd seen before. Long, pale fingers reached for me. I pulled myself through the crevice just as those fingers brushed my jacket. The passage beyond was tight but navigable, leading upward. I scrambled through, using my flashlight to find handholds in the rock. Behind me, the clicking sounds grew louder, more frenzied. Something scraped against the stone, trying to follow. The passage twisted and turned, growing narrower in places. I had to turn sideways to squeeze through the tightest spots. My breath came in ragged gasps, echoing off the stone walls. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw a faint glow ahead. Moonlight. The passage opened onto the side of the hill, a small opening hidden by bushes. I squeezed through and emerged into the night air, gulping it down like I'd been drowning. I was on the hillside above the main trail, maybe a quarter-mile from where I'd entered the cave. Clicking sounds came from the passage behind me. They were still following. I ran down the hillside, slipping and sliding in the snow, catching myself on tree trunks, branches whipping at my face. I hit the main trail and sprinted toward the trailhead where I'd left my truck. Behind me, the forest came alive with sounds, branches breaking, that strange stop-motion movement through the trees. Voices called my name, first Alvin's, then Carl's, then my sister's. I ignored them all and kept running. I reached my truck as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into reverse, backing out of the trailhead parking area. As I turned to drive away, my headlights swept across the tree line. For just a moment they illuminated a line of tall, thin figures standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. Then I was on the access road, driving as fast as I dared on the snow-covered pavement. I made it back to the station as the sun crested the mountains. Alice was waiting on the porch, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept. Carl stood beside her, his face grim. "Did you find him?" Alice asked as I climbed out of the truck. I shook my head, unable to speak yet. My throat felt raw from running and fear. "What happened out there?" Carl asked, helping me up the steps. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. Inside, I collapsed into a chair at the main desk. Alice brought me coffee while Carl waited for me to catch my breath. "There's a cave," I finally said. "Not on any of our maps. Alvin's radio and flashlight were outside it." Inside, I swallowed hard. Inside there were things, personal items, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, from missing people going back decades. Reeves' badge was in there, Maggie's recorder. Carl's face went pale. And Alvin? His jacket was there, deeper in the cave, but it was a trap. They were waiting for me. I looked up at them. Alvin's gone, just like the others. Alice put her hand on my shoulder. "What do we do now?" I reached for my copy of the rules lying on the desk where I'd left it yesterday. I picked up a pen and added a 7th line at the bottom. 7. Never enter unmarked caves no matter who you think is inside. "We survive," I said. "We follow the rules, and we make sure everyone else does too." I looked at Alice, seeing the fear and confusion in her eyes. The same fear I'd felt when Alvin first handed me these rules. She needed to understand, just as I had needed to understand. "I'll teach you everything Alvin taught me," I told her, "and you'll teach the next person. That's how we honor him. That's how we survive." Carl nodded slowly. "I'll call the sheriff. We need to report Alvin missing." "Tell them we need a search party," I said. "But no one goes near that cave. No one." As Carl went to make the call, I stared down at the 7 rules. Alvin was gone, but his legacy would continue. I would make sure of it. Every new ranger would learn these rules, understand them, respect them, because out there in the forest, the entities were waiting, and they wouldn't forget my intrusion into their trophy room. They never forgot.